Okay, well, I guess I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for tuning in. I'm Paul Gray. I work for Audubon in Florida. I'm an ecologist in our Everglades restoration program. And tonight I'm going to talk about wide-ranging topics. One of my interests, I'm not really a historian, but I've been interested in the history of the bird conservation movement and even of discovering American birds and how early people were trying to figure out what we had here. And so I'm going to start clear back almost when Christopher Columbus came across, and then carry it up to some of the very first ornithologists who really started getting a pretty good handle on North American bird life, and how those ornithologists also were concerned about the slaughter of birds because we were killing plume birds and market hunting and passenger pigeons were going extinct, all that, and how they started the Audubon conservation movement. And then I'm going to carry the early part of the Audubon conservation movement to my program on Lake Okeechobee, which started in 1936, and talk about what we do today compared to what we used to do. So we're off. Okay, so back in the 1500s, when Europeans, they had their sailing ships, and first they rounded the Horn of Africa during the 1400s. And in the 1500s, of course, they started coming across the Atlantic. And a lot of those ships, they wanted to find out what was out there. They were trying to make money. And so they wanted to know where were trees that we could log, where are good soils where we could grow crops, where are minerals that we could make mines, where are good fisheries, where whatever. And so on all these boats, they would put scientists who would document what they found. And Charles Darwin is probably the most famous one. He was on the Beagle. He wasn't on the Beagle to discover evolution. As a matter of fact, he was a geologist. And he was there just to document what they found. So these were very broadly trained people. And so these are two of the very earliest bird drawings from North America. And you notice they look identical. That's because not only there wasn't much information, but everybody plagiarized each other. The first pretty good book about North American wildlife was Mark Catesby. And he put out this book. Now, remember, these are lithographs. This is something that you etch onto a piece of paper and then you hand color it. So if he wanted to put out 100 editions of his book, he would have to hand color 100 of these belted kingfishers, and that would just be one plate in his book. So very, very labor intensive. Not many of these books came out. Catesby was able to identify about 100 species of birds in America. And of course, here's the Carolina parakeet. And if you ever see the genus and species of the American bullfrog, it's Rana catesbiensis. Linnaeus gave that name to him in recognition of his work on North American birds. Another guy who was very active was George Louis Leclerc, and he was French. And he was kind of an academic guy, and he was a monster cataloger. All these ships would come back to France, and he would get the stuff off it, and he would document them and write them and stuff like that. He was at a great disadvantage because he was sitting in Paris and he really didn't get to see any of these animals. He did it with mammals and all. He didn't get to see them alive. He didn't get to see them when they were fresh. So he didn't have good soft color parts, like this black skimmer should have orange legs and a red bill. And he didn't even get to know their life poses. And sometimes he would get specimens that weren't even labeled with where they came from. So he'd even have the continent wrong. So he made quite a few mistakes, but he actually was a master cataloger. And one of the things about him being French, he thought that France and French things were the supreme pinnacle of everything in the world. And so when he would see like a green-winged teal from America, which was different from a green-winged teal in Europe, he thought we had a degenerate teal. Same with our common gallinule, which looks like a moorhen over there. And he carried this to all other countries. He was, we're French, we're the best in the world, and everything else is degenerate. And that really ticked off a lot of people. So one of them was Alexander Wilson, and he wrote the very first really good ornithology of America in 1810 to 1814. And remember, this was the age when Thomas Jefferson was very active in politics. And Jefferson went over to France, and he got wind of Leclerc's, everything's degenerate in America. And he actually apparently had called back and had some people send a moose to Europe to say, we have the biggest cervid in the world, so don't tell us our stuff's degenerate. And Wilson knew Jefferson, and so Wilson was really mad about degrading American birds because he loved them. And I bought this print because this is actually one of the ones from his book because of the grasshopper sparrow here. And I had to pay extra for it for these gaudy birds here. But anyway, Wilson wrote this book all on his own. He was not a scientist. He didn't have sponsors. He would sell volumes of his book and go do it. And he was with the Bartram family in Philadelphia, which gave him a lot of intellectual support. And so you notice here's Wilson's skimmer right here, and here's Leclerc's. And again, I mentioned, the orange and the color. And so Wilson, one of the things he really didn't like about Leclerc is he had these things that he just couldn't control for because he was in Paris. And so one of the characteristics of Alexander Wilson's paintings was he would say drawn from nature by Alexander Wilson. And this differentiated him from Leclerc because Wilson said, you know, I've seen these birds, I know their behavior, I know how many eggs they have in their nests, I know their plumages. And so it gave him a great advantage. And when he wrote this book, his American Ornithology, it was considered the best ornithology for America, but it might have been the best scientific work in the history of America because it was only 1810, you know. So it was quite a monumental work. And he was trying to help people identify birds. He would draw them kind of stylistically, see how the tail is turned so you can see the white rectrices. And so he wasn't trying to be artistic. He was trying to help people identify them. And he was just a really good scientist. Like back then, people were trying to figure out the orioles. And you think about the orioles, sometimes the first year male is different from an adult male. And so you have immatures that are one color, you have first year males that are another, the adults are another, the females are another. Sometimes they're molting between immature or adult plumage, and so they look even more bizarre. And so there were like 10 or 15 kinds of orioles that had been identified, and Wilson would keep them in cages and watch them through their molts. And so he was able to sort out a lot of the confusion of the time. And this is someone doing this on his own in his bedroom. And if you don't know if you've heard of Alexander Wilson, what kind of plover do we have? What kind of warbler do we have? What kind of phalarope? There's a Wilson storm petrel. So anyway, there's let's see, what's the other one? Oh, the Wilson snipe. So there's 5 American birds named after Wilson. So he has more birds named after him than any other scientist, which comes with going first. So the next great bird guy, and we all know who this guy is, John James Audubon, he came about 20 years after Wilson. And Wilson was able to get about 200 species of birds, well, 250 species of birds, whereas Catesby only had about 100. And so Audubon came along 20 years later, and he actually met Wilson when Wilson was on one of his tours to try to collect birds and build his book. But Audubon had a similar vision of doing a book on his own, but he was much more of an artistic type person. And so he had these very glamorous drawings of birds. And they're very nuanced. They're not made to be a scientific specimen. They're made to be beautiful and captivating. And so he went around and did this, and he got together a whole portfolio. He was drawing these birds life size. Look at how big this book was. That's why when you look at the picture of the white pelican, it looks all kind of distorted because he had to get it all on that one page, and that's a huge bird. But anyway, so he had this grand vision, and he went to Philadelphia, and he was going to be the next Alexander Wilson. And they weren't going to have any of it because Alexander Wilson was a favorite son because he had such a great book. And so they kind of ran him out of town on a rail. They said, no, Alexander Wilson's a great guy and you're just, whoever you are. And that might have been a benefit to Audubon because what he did was he went to England and he was a sensation. He was the American woodsman. He was an artist. He was flamboyant. And the English just loved him. And he ended up doing all of his prints over in England. And with his higher artistic techniques and shading and nuance, the English lithographers, whoever, the English technicians probably could make better birds for him. And it may have helped his book do better. And of course, once England and in Europe accepted him, then when he came back to the Americas, he had great acclaim. This is a bird I have hanging in my office. I mean, just beautiful work. He made a lot of mistakes. Wilson, out of his 250 birds, only had about 5 that were wrong. Audubon had quite a few more. And Wilson's reputation was so big that Audubon actually copied 2 of Wilson's mistakes and claimed he had seen them too. So the pressure was on him. But he did end up getting more than 400 birds. So that increased the American bird list by quite a bit. And a lot of that was Western birds. He got further west than Wilson was able to do. Wilson only had 2 Western birds that I know of. And one was Lewis's woodpecker, and the other was the Clark's nutcracker, because he knew Lewis and Clark. And when they came back from their expedition, they actually had those skins, and so he named them after Lewis and Clark. And of course, he never got to see those in life, kind of like Leclerc. So he didn't have really good accounts of them, but at least he got to give patronyms to those 2 men. Remember I mentioned plagiarism? Well, here's Wilson's Mississippi kite. Here's Audubon's. So sometimes Audubon couldn't find some of the birds that Wilson got, so he would kind of borrow as he needed to. Okay, so those 2 guys were self-made. They did it all on their own. They did it by selling books. By the mid 1850s, we started having institutions like universities and museums, and the Smithsonian opened up around 1850. And so then they started hiring professional ornithologists. And that way we had people who were specialists in ornithology and who could really focus. And it became an age of hyper taxonomy, where they were trying to identify every single bird in the country. And this book, Ridgway's book, has like 100 pages of these detailed drawings of the toenails of every animal you can think of. And it was an age of shotgun ornithology. Basically, optics were really bad back then, and they were trying to get specimens for their museums, and also just so they could identify them and get a good look at them, they needed to shoot these birds. And so this shotgun on top, this is from my collection. These are just some collectible items. This was made in about 1800. This is the same kind of gun that both Wilson and Audubon shot. It's a flintlock shotgun. And this gun was around for a long time. And there's 3 American sayings that we have. This part of the gun is called the lock. This is called the stock and barrel, lock, stock, and barrel. It came from this gun. And the hammer on this gun, when you pull it back to fire the gun, if you pull it all the way back, you can shoot it. But if you're not ready to shoot, you only pull it halfway back and it clicks into place, and then it won't shoot. And so if you go off half cocked, because it's only halfway pulled back, then that's what half cocked is. And then the other thing is, when it would hit the frisson, there would be a little pan right here that would have gunpowder in it, and the little hole that goes into the firing chamber, and it would flash the pan, and then it burn down the hole and shoot the gun off. But if you flash the pan and you didn't have a shot, what are you? Flash in the pan. So this gun really has more to do with us today than what people know. This is a more modern shotgun. This is about 1870, and you could break it. This is a modern double barrel prototype, and you could put a cartridge in there. You didn't have to muzzle load it. You didn't have to pour in the powder, then put in the shot. So this was a very advanced gun compared to this gun. This little thing is a flambeau. It's a French parlor shooting gun, and it more or less shoots a little 22 cap. And it's real weak. I mean, you can't kill anything unless you're about 20 or 30 feet from it. And when Cuthbert Rookery was shot out by Cuthbert, he reportedly used one of these guns, because if you just walked up under the tree and just shot the bird, it sounded like a twig snap, and it was close enough to kill the plume bird. It was unlike these guns, which were very, very noisy and would scare away all the birds. So these were favored by some of these plume hunters. And then this little gun, this is a little portable pocket pistols that they use for when you're traveling or when you're camping. And this is called a marble game getter. Herbert Stoddard used to carry one of these when he traveled around the country. And I have this now. This is an illegal gun, and it's illegal because it has a folding stock. And back in the 1930s, they had prohibition, gangsters, and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and they passed gun laws back then that said, you know, the proverbial Tommy gun in the violin case. They said no more folding stocks, and also no sawed-off shotguns. And this little gun, this top barrel is a 22 caliber gun to shoot small bullets. This bottom barrel is 40 caliber to either shoot a slug for medium-sized game, or you could put in a 410 shotgun shell and shoot birds. And so it's only 15 inches long, and that got outlawed. And actually they passed a fixer law later because the people that own these guns said, hey, you know, I'm not running around doing massacres. You didn't mean to outlaw this gun. So I have a special stamp and I can possess it. But anyway, it's kind of a funny artifact. So during the 1850s and 60s and 70s, there were a lot of people that collected birds. We got a very good understanding of American birds. And in the 1880s, when we shot out all these things that I'd mentioned earlier, like passenger pigeons and bison and Carolina parakeets and great auks, I think were gone by then. There was a guy we were named for John James Audubon, not by him. And it's George Bird Grinnell. And he was an early editor of Forest and Stream, which now is Field and Stream. And he actually was tutored by Lucy Audubon, who was Audubon's widow. And so he wanted to make a bird and wildlife preservation and awareness club, mostly targeted at children. And he named it the Audubon Society, just in honor of John James Audubon. And he sent out flyers and information for about 4 years, but he ended up with like 50,000 subscriptions, and it just got to be too much. And so he quit. But you know, 50,000 subscriptions back in the 1880s is quite a bit. Meanwhile, this guy was a curator at the American Museum of Natural History. And I'm going to come back to Frank Chapman a lot because he was very important in the founding of Audubon. He was the first editor of Bird Lore, which is now Audubon magazine. He's the one that invented the Christmas bird count. And he also helped make the model bird law. Now, this is T. Gilbert Pearson, and he was the second president of Audubon. The first president of the National Audubon Society had a stroke, and Pearson filled in for him for about 10 years until he finally passed away. But Pearson was really the active guy who started going around trying to pass bird laws. And I have some examples of laws that were passed, over the time when people were concerned about stuff. And it wasn't really until we got to 1901 where we had the model bird law. And what the model bird law was they would pass laws and say, okay, you can't shoot this or that or this or that. But everybody had a different name. And so if you went out and said, okay, you just shot a cardinal and you're under arrest, they'd say, no, I didn't. I shot a redbird. So the model bird law was developed by Chapman and the ornithologists. And what they did was they said, okay, we're going to identify just the birds you can shoot and everything else is off limits. And so waterfowl got into the game birds, and we're going to set a season limits on them. The grouse and quail and turkeys got into that, and a couple other birds, and then everything else was off limit. And that law was adopted in myriad states right around 1900. And when you read Pearson's autobiography, I thought, he would go to Florida and he'd say, yeah, I went to Florida and I got the model bird law passed. And then I went to North Carolina and I passed it there. And I went to Massachusetts and I passed it there. And I went to New York and I passed it there. And I was thinking, how could this nerdy guy go into these state legislatures and just get them to pass a law telling all their citizens of the state, many of whom were still subsistence hunting, stop shooting birds? Well, one thing he didn't mention was women. Women were very, very important in the early Audubon movement. The founder of the Florida Audubon Society was Clara Domerich, and she lived in Orlando. Her husband was a wealthy agricultural and industrialist. She formed a board for the first Audubon Society, and Teddy Roosevelt was an honorary member. The president of Rollins College was a member. The wife of the governor of Florida was a member. And so just a who's who list of people. And what it was these women were educated, but they couldn't work because that was frowned upon. They couldn't even vote at that time, but they were very active. And so they would grease the skids. And when Pearson would show up, they already had everything rigged. And he didn't ever mention this in his autobiography, that actually it was the women there doing it. And if you want to read about this, Leslie Kemp Poole from Rollins College has a really great book about it. And here's even a joke about Frank Chapman showing up with his women. This is from 1901. They were very powerful. And see her scolding the kid who's been shooting birds. And that looks like Alfred Newman. Anyway, so this bird movement, not only were we trying to pass laws, but we were trying to make it unfashionable. And the fight to protect birds was going on across the ocean too. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds was kind of the equivalent of the Audubon societies in America. And they were doing stuff to stop the slaughter of birds all around the world. Okay, so the people who were hunting and scientific collecting and doing all this stuff are a very mixed breed. So I about fell out of my boat when I saw a picture of this guy, Joseph H. Batty. And notice it's from the American Museum of Natural History. He's a really interesting character. For one, he wrote this marvelous book, Practical Taxidermy and Home Decoration. And notice it's 1880. Basically, he wrote a book and he said, now in this day of, people are getting more and more prosperous and we have time on our hands and we have nicer homes. What fireplace mantle doesn't look better with a pair of mounted Baltimore Orioles? And so he wrote this whole book about how you could shoot and stuff things and decorate your home with them. And it's actually a very practical and good book. It's good on taxidermy. He tells you how to make frames for mammals. He tells you what kind of guns to use, what kind of shot to use. He tells you how big of a wood lot you need to live next to if you're going to camp for the winter to make sure you have enough wood to cut. A very competent book. He even has stuff on gun safety. Well, not only was he a taxidermist from the New England area, but in the plume hunting trade down in Florida, there was a guy named W.E.D. Scott, William Earl Dodge Scott. And he came down, he was out of Princeton, and he came down and went around Florida right after the Civil War in the 1860s. And he was one of the first people to really write about the plume bird colonies in the Everglades. And, million bird, 2 million birds, we don't know. He couldn't estimate them either. But just these vast colonies that probably might have been the largest wading bird colonies on the planet. And so he put it in scientific journals and stuff like that. He came back in the 1880s, about 20 years later, and went to those same colonies and they were gone. They had all been shot out. And he was just absolutely mortified. And when he got around to Fort Myers, he heard there was a market hunter sitting outside of town hunting on a sandbar. And so he sailed out to meet this guy and talk to him. And it was Joseph Batty. And Batty at that time had 60 hunters along the Gulf of Mexico from Fort Myers up to Cedar Key or however far north they were hunting. And they would all send him skins and he would send them to New York for the millinery trade. And the numbers of birds that went to New York is just beyond belief. And they were being made into hats and decorative ornaments. And so this is something that really offended, especially the women in the Audubon movement, and said, you know, we shouldn't be killing these birds and wiping out entire populations just for vanity. And so here's a picture of a guy with a plume bird. And we're back to Gilbert Pearson. And here's this account of the Snowy Egret. And this is back from about 1895. And he writes, the curse of beauty has numbered the days of this most dainty and graceful of herons. 20 years ago, it was abundant in the South. Now it is the rarest of its family. The delicate egrets which it donned as a nuptial dress were its death warrant. Women demanded from the bird its wedding plumes, and man has supplied the demand. The Florida herons have gone, and now he's pursuing the helpless birds at the uttermost parts of the earth. Mercilessly, they are shot down at their roosts or nesting grounds. The coveted feathers are stripped from their backs. The carcasses are left to rot. And while the young in the nest are above starving. But then, you know, the little bunch of egrets in yonder jaunty body is so pretty, so becoming. Chapman's a scientist, and he's supposed to be writing about the natural history of this bird in this part of his description, but he's just so angry about the slaughter of these birds that he devoted this part of his book to saying we shouldn't be doing this. Well, so anyway, these are some skins that Ann Paul got when we did a history of ornithology at the Tampa History Center. Notice who signed this, W.E.D. Scott. So these birds were shot by Scott. He was on Lake Panasoffkee, and that was on his second trip down here, 1876. While he was on Panasoffkee, he also shot 40 snail kites because he needed a big collection for his museum. And not only he wanted to get a bunch of birds so he would have a range of sizes and plumage characteristics, but collectors also traded them. And he could get snail kites. Not many people could get those. So he could trade them for tantalizing birds that people in other parts of the country got that he couldn't get. So the conservationists and the scientists were shooting birds at the same time they were decrying we were shooting too many birds. And here's a manual of taxidermy by Maynard, another prominent ornithologist. And of course, market hunting. You know, if you go hunt birds for your family, you just shoot 3 or 4 and you go home. But if you're shooting birds for the market, and the more you sell, the more money you make these outrageous guns and rigs. And these guys would go out on Chesapeake Bay and a lot of the East Coast especially and shoot hundreds and thousands of birds. And so waterfowl were crashing, and this was another slaughter that people thought should be stopped. So one of the things they did was they tried to tell everybody, well, birds matter. They're important. And so here's Economic Value of Birds by Chapman. Here's Useful Birds and Their Protection by Forbush. And they were trying to tell people, well, you know, those birds are eating insects and they're protecting your orchard from pest infestations, and hawks are eating mice, which eat your crops. And so they were trying to make not just a sentimental argument, but, you know, birds are important to you. And so Chapman, once again, I'll read another one of his rants. It says, of these, this is about birds in Florida. Of these birds, herons, egrets, ibises, spoonbills, and others, the state of Florida once possessed a marvelous store, but be it said to Florida's everlasting disgrace that until the honorable industry of shooting birds at the nest became no longer profitable, she raised no hand to save herself from being despoiled of this rich heritage. Even then, the passage of laws was secured only through influence from without, the Audubon Societies. The laws, however, were not observed, and all efforts to secure conviction under them failed. So this was 1908. He was still mad about how we had laws in place, but they were not being enforced. Well, Audubon hired wardens, and this is Guy Bradley, who famously got killed in the Everglades by plume hunters. We had another warden in Charlotte County get killed by plume hunters. They never found his body, but they found his boat with blood and stuff in it. There's another guy who was killed in South Carolina. Our Orange Lake near Gainesville warden was shot, but not killed. Very rough work, and Audubon was hiring people who actually were enforcing the laws. And here's the contract for Paul Krogel. It just says $1 per month. He was the first warden on Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge, which is our first national wildlife refuge. And here's a diorama of the refuge in the American Museum of Natural History, which of course is where Frank Chapman was working. And he made this diorama, and he was a friend of Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt made this the first national wildlife refuge because Chapman wanted it designated and protected. And so he got it designated as a refuge. We got Paul Krogel hired, or Krogel, however you say it. And so we were doing a lot of the work that nowadays we have agencies doing. And so back to Chapman, he's writing about Carolina parakeets when he was at the Sebastian River. And he says at about 10 o'clock, they returned to the hummock and apparently to share some favorite tree, here to pass the rest of the morning and early evening when they again started out to feed, returning to the roost just before sunset. A flock of these birds feeding among the thistles is the most beautiful and animated sight. One is almost persuaded not to disturb them. There is constant movement as they fly from plant to plant, or when securing thistles, they fly with them in their bills to a neighboring tree, there to dissect them at their leisure. The loud rolling call is apparently uttered only when on the wing, but when at rest or feeding, there is a loud conversational murmur of half-articulate, querulous notes and call. So he was watching these Carolina parakeets on the Sebastian River and just thinking, wow, what a beautiful thing. Look who signed these skins, Frank Chapman, March 15th, Sebastian River. And he wrote, and this was when the birds were almost gone. And he wrote, I felt bad shooting these things, but I needed skins. And I think if I see some more, I'm going to just let them pass. And 2 weeks later, he did see some more and he shot them too. So one of the reasons he did it, he said, they're feathered documents that we need them for science. And even if they're going extinct, they give us something in history. And in this case, we don't have any more Carolina parakeets except these skins. And so in some ways, these are feathered documents. And if you go to the Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park, there's this big bronze statue from the Lost Bird Project. And this is a Carolina parakeet, and it's looking at the last place the Carolina parakeets were ever found, some eggs collected out of Gum Slough. And this is in Okeechobee County. The Lost Bird Guy did about 6 of these statues, and there's a great auk, which is on some New Brunswick Island. There's a Labrador duck in New York. There's a Eskimo curlew in Texas. There's a passenger pigeon in Michigan. There's a heath hen on Martha's Vineyard. So he put these things at the last place these birds were seen with a motto that because forgetting is a second extinction. And so Chapman wrote a bird book, and it was much more practical than Wilson's or Audubon's, that you could carry it with you in the field and identify birds. But you notice something about it is, how are you going to know if the toes of these birds look like that unless you shoot it? So this was 1895. This is a very, very popular book, but it also still required you to shoot a bird when you're bird watching. And that was getting to a lot of people, including Chapman. And so he made this bird book, and this is like one of the very first field guides, and you didn't have to shoot the bird. One of the other interesting things is, if you notice how many yellowthroats there were: Florida yellowthroat, Pacific, Northern, salt marsh yellowthroat, Belding. This was the age of hypertaxonomy. And so they didn't have a handful of yellowthroats, they had a whole long list. And so back then, the bird list for North America would have been probably 2,000 birds. Now we think it's more like 800 with variations across the country. But anyway, he was trying to get people, okay, going out to enjoy birds doesn't have to mean killing them. And you can just watch them. And again, he started the Christmas bird count. Let's go look at birds, not shoot them. And women, of course, were leading the way. Florence Merriam, and 10 years before that, Birds Through the Opera Glass. And she was trying to encourage people, go look at them, don't shoot them. And I just read a book about early conservation, and the author compared the men conservationists to the women, and the men wanted to conserve things, but they were shooting them too. And the women were more, we need to conserve things for the sake of conserving them. And they were much more of the conscience of the environmental movement. And so Howell, in his Florida Bird Life, he gave a tribute to Audubon, and he called it the finally triumphant struggle of the National Audubon Societies. Is unparalleled because of all the dead birds. And you think about the 1930s, we've been fighting about this for 40 years. No organization has ever encountered more disappointments or more bitter discouragement with its efforts, and none has ever overcome them with more splendid success. And what he was referring to is by the 1930s and 40s, the wading birds in the Everglades had actually pretty well recovered. And when Helen Cruikshank was down there in the 1930s, there were maybe 500,000 birds at Cuthbert Rookery. And that's when she took this picture of Marvin Chandler, who's the very first Audubon warden on Lake Okeechobee. And there's a badge. It wasn't his badge, but notice he's got 2 belt buckles. So I'm going to kind of switch gears now and go more to the Okeechobee program. And I essentially have his job and talk about the larger context. But because by this time, they had made a lot of success in stopping a lot of the senseless killing. And by the way, this water moccasin, which was almost 6 feet long, they couldn't get around it when they were coming back out. They were photographing glossy ibises, which at that time, 90 to 95% of all the glossies in North America were nesting on Okeechobee. So they were very protective of it. But they killed this thing. And in its stomach, it had a glossy ibis egg, 3 tricolored heron eggs, a digested egg, a baby American egret, and an adult glossy ibis. So Shazam. And in 1938, the governor and cabinet also designated some marsh areas inside Lake Okeechobee as wildlife sanctuaries that we could help FWC manage, because back then the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission didn't really have a big cadre of wildlife officers, and that's why we were hiring wardens. They're still in the lake. They're mostly symbolic nowadays. They don't let me carry a badge and gun, but we still use that, saying we've been here since 1936, fighting for Lake Okeechobee and fighting for the bird life of this region. And we made a lot of rookeries back then. So it was Audubon not only passing laws, but trying to establish sanctuaries and also win the public opinion that you shouldn't be shooting birds just for the heck of it. So here's his boat. I get to have an airboat. Here they are getting ready to go out and photograph the glossy ibises on Lake Okeechobee. And here's a glossy. They're actually pretty common today. One of those conservation successes that we don't think much of. And even people from Okeechobee County, which is nothing but a cow town back then, they actually wrote a letter in support of the sanctuaries. They said, we appreciate and believe in their work. We believe it's reasonable protection of wildlife as we practice and promote by the society helps our town. Now the Chandlers, the first 4 people to work for Audubon were Chandlers, and they were all from one of the founding families of Okeechobee County. So they were locals enforcing local laws, which is a lot better than a Yankee coming there. And so here's Marvin at some eggs. And these eggs were for a guy named Charles Doe. And he would come around and he would pay farm boys and whoever, to get eggs and hide them. And then he would come buy them and he'd go put them in his collection. And this was in the 1930s. And apparently he got crossways with somebody and they threatened to kill him and he never came back. And so Marvin was told about this and went out and found him. And here's Doe in front of his collection. And so he was a scientist, but the Chandlers were trying to stop him from collecting. And by the way, the Carolina parakeet eggs that got us the statue at the Kissimmee Prairie Preserve were collected by this guy. He's the one that got them. And they're still in a collection up in Gainesville. Here's another thing. Here's Rod Chandler, and he's looking up this tree, and here's what he's looking at. Those are climbing spikes. And this tree was a perennial nesting tree for crested caracaras. And so once Marvin found out that Doe was coming down and climbing up this tree, he would wait till they nested and he'd climb up there and he'd stamp the eggs property of the National Audubon Society to try to prevent Doe from being able to put them in his collection. So this is all real. These are the Nicholson Brothers. If you read the old Florida Field Naturalists, they wrote tons of articles and they were collectors, egg hunters, very good ornithologists. So again, it's back to scientists were still doing stuff that, not to the scale that plume hunters did, but you're kind of a collector and a bird savior at the same time. And here's Marvin with his 4-wheel drive vehicle when he gets off the road. So Glenn succeeded Marvin and worked for about 17 years, his nephew. And Roger Torrey Peterson visited Okeechobee in 1953, and I couldn't wait to read his account of what Okeechobee looked like, because I want to know what did the lake look like before, all the modern changes. And it turns out that Glenn and Sam Grimes had found the first cattle egret nest on Lake Okeechobee that was found in North America. And Peterson got there afterward and went out to see the cattle egret and wrote this whole glowing chapter about how wonderful it was to see a cattle egret nest in Lake Okeechobee. and didn't write anything else about the ecology of Lake Okeechobee. So anyway, and even drew a picture of the cattle egret with a Brahma bull. And so Glenn was succeeded by Rod Chandler. Here's Rod, and I've mentioned him before. Here he is with Noel Snyder out looking for Carolina parakeets. Noel wrote the book about Carolina parakeets, and he was hoping that there still might be some somewhere out in the swamp that nobody knew about. So not only the wardens patrolled Lake Okeechobee, but they also went up to the prairies. There's a railroad spur that went out of Bassinger that went straight up. It's called the Peavine. It went up through here, went up through Kenansville, all the way up to the Orlando area, and they would haul out trees and all the kind of stuff that they would get. And so Rod would put he had a Model A or Model T, and they were exactly the same width as the railroad tracks. And he and his brothers and friends would ride up the rail on top of the tracks and get off and patrol around up here. And the cattlemen liked him doing that because there was just one more person out to watch for cattle rustlers. But notice this cluster of pink dots. Those are wading bird rookeries. This little piece of property, I'll tell you in a minute, is the original Audubon Sanctuary. No coincidence it was there. And it's at the Kissimmee Prairie, now preserved state park. And the prairie is this huge grassland of trees. And we have about 25 lightning strikes per square mile per year. And so it makes this grassland. Trees can't get established in the uplands, and cypress trees don't grow in the wetlands. And I take people out there and they're just flabbergasted by the wide open spaces. And prairies are weird since they burn, we think probably every 1 to 3 years. This dark thing here, this is an oak tree. They call it a runner oak because if you pull up one of those stems, it'll be hooked to the next one and the next one and the next one. And we're all used to oak trees growing with a trunk and then branching out up above the ground. But with all the fires, these guys branch out underneath the ground and then send up expendable particles. So when the fire comes, and they produce acorns just like regular oak trees. Some of these oaks with similar growth patterns out west have been known to cover 800 acres, one tree, and have been estimated at 10,000 years old or older. We haven't done similar work on the prairie, but Archibald has done work on some of these palmetto clumps, and we think they're 5,000 years old. And so the prairie is a short community, but it's an old growth community. And we have unfortunately plowed under 90% of these prairies. And this is one of the most biodiverse plant communities in North America, has the longest butterfly list of any park in the state. And here it is from the air. It's just this big flat landscape. And historically, when it would rain, all this would fill up with water. And even these palmetto flats out here would all be full of water by the end of September. And they'd stay that way for 2 months. And the water would slowly get to this little sluice system here, and then it'd meander down toward the Kissimmee River, and then it'd make it to Okeechobee. But historically, this watershed would be completely wet by the end of the wet season, and it would take us 6 months to dry out. And I'm going to talk about the drainage because it doesn't do that anymore. We've drained it, and it really affects Lake Okeechobee. And our conservation concerns with Okeechobee and the Everglades are no longer shooting its hydrology and nutrients. So the other reason they're going to the prairie is there's 5 endemic prairie birds. This is the Florida sandhill crane. They never leave Florida. They breed here. They live here. Florida's mottled duck, same deal. The Florida burrowing owl, again, they're here. They're out west. Audubon's crested caracara, they're here. They're out west. He got his caracara up near St. Augustine, and he drew it from nature just like Wilson did. And then the star of the show, the Florida grasshopper sparrow. And so these guys are all unique subspecies. When birders would come to Florida, they'd all go out to the prairie to see these birds. And that's part of the reason the Chandlers were patrolling that area, also for the wading bird resources. And so here's Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park. Here's the old Audubon Sanctuary. We helped Nature Conservancy put in a bid to buy this property. It's the biggest tract of dry prairie left, and it is now all in conservation. And it was because Audubon cared about the prairies. And it was the very first time anybody in the state had bought dry prairie for the sake of saving dry prairie. We'd bought some properties that had dry prairie, but Audubon was there to buy dry prairie. And Rod Chandler had written in his notes in the 1970s, I wish I could get somebody to buy the Maxey property, and he lived to see it done. So that was really satisfying for me. And here's the letter from Dick Poe, who was one of the principals in the Nature Conservancy who helped us buy the sanctuary, the original sanctuary. He also used to come on these birding tours in the 40s. And we told him, now that we bought the big preserve, we want to sell the Audubon Sanctuary to be part of it. And he wrote, I feel that the Good Hill grant, that was what he gave us, was the key to what is now a 50,000 acre preserve. So that was really nice to get that letter from him, knowing that his seed grew into something really big. Okay, back to Okeechobee and its issues. Here's a beautiful Okeechobee with a snail kite foraging. And just another snail kite eye candy. And there you can see the snail. You see the very long talons for holding on these big round snails. Oh, and Okeechobee, these are all, this eye candy is from Tyler Beck. He was banding birds on some islands in Okeechobee. So, we think about wading birds and kites and things like that, but these are all neotropical migrants, and they're tanking up before they fly across the ocean, or they're coming back from the ocean and they're trying to tank up before they go further north. So we're important not just to Florida birds, but to all these birds traveling through the hemispheres. And what they want to do is find healthy ecosystems full of what these are midges, locals call them chizzywinks. And if those little bug-eating warblers can find this leaf, they get fat in a hurry. And so we want to keep this ecosystem as productive and as functional as we can, because it's not just about our birds, it's about all birds. And of course, we're Audubon and we love birds because they're pretty, but they put some tents over trees in Missouri. And you can see this yellow warbler with a caterpillar. And basically the trees started getting caterpillar and bug outbreaks, and they started losing 25% of their leaves, as opposed to the trees right next to them in the forest were only losing 13%. And it's significantly slowed down the growth of those trees. And so if you are a forester in Pennsylvania or New Brunswick, you may not realize it, but it matters to you if these birds come back. And in that sense, it matters to you if the Everglades is protected and restored. And, we've heard about 3 billion birds lost in North America in the last few decades. It's really important for us. We're at a key spot. We are literally the neck of a funnel. So acre for acre, Florida is more important than most areas of the country, just because of our flyway position. So again, and North America has more migrating species than other continents. And 250 species out of our 800 winter south of the Tropic of Cancer. We're really important. And so it makes my job just more urgent. So I mentioned that shooting used to be the problem, but now it's habitat. And so in the 1950s, 40s, we had really wet hurricanes and the Corps came in. We asked them to come drain the Everglades. And they did a pretty good job. And so you can see Florida's all buggered up and you can see it from outer space. And so we drained the state. And now, we have all this is Everglades. It's about half the original extent, but it only supports 10% of the birds, because what's here is all screwed up from bad hydrology in the lake. Because what happens is when it rains now, instead of all this water emptying in 6 months, it does it in 1 month. The lake goes up real fast. It gets a whole bunch of nutrients. It gets algae blooms. The Corps gets afraid of the dike. They dump the water. I'm sure most of you have heard about this bad cycle. And what we want to do to reverse this problem in Everglades restoration is find places to catch water outside of the lake, so we don't get into that bad high water, nutrient plume, dumping water mode. And again, here's what they did. Here's the good old days. All the water would go into the lake. It would all flow down the Everglades. Everything was hunky-dory. But the engineers, when they said drain the state, they're like, well, it's only 40 miles to here and it's 100 miles down here. This is much more efficient. So they turned all the water going east and west, and now the Everglades does not get enough. And so we're going to try to change this around by catching the water, sending it in an orderly fashion to the Everglades, and quit dumping it harmfully to the estuaries. And and then the algae blooms. This is 2018. This is July. As you can see, the middle of the lake's all blown up in algae. Obviously, this is not something we want to have happen, and this is something we're going to have to reverse. And notice the marshes in the lake. These are the Audubon Sanctuaries. They're not involved in the bloom because they have vascular plants and they're taking up the nutrients. The algae can't get in there. But out here in the middle of the ocean, the middle of the lake, that's the algae get all the nutrients. And so here's signs on, let's see, Lee County. This is on the West Coast. This is on the East Coast. These are signs at the boat ramps saying, don't touch the water. And you think about Florida, and we have this water tourism economy, and where we think about fishing and swimming and bird watching, and to have signs like this, there's no chamber of commerce on the planet that wants to have signs like this. So this is something we're going to have to fix. And, it leads to jokes like this, which I get it, you know, it's kind of funny, but it hurts my feelings because this is such a spectacular lake. And here's just a montage of pictures of it. You know, here's coots that come down by the thousands when things are good. The Eleocris flats. We catch like 1 million crappie out of this lake a year, and it's also a world famous bass fishery. Here's some submerged aquatic vegetation. That's under the water. That's how clear the water is back in the marsh where the plants can clean the water. And of course, kites. And so this is something we have to protect as well as we can. Yeah, we've got an algae problem, but we also have great resources left. And the trick is we want to store it. When it rains, we don't want all the water to glug into the lake right away. We want to catch a bunch of it and then meter it into the lake. If you can catch it, you can clean it. And then when we move it on, it doesn't pollute. And then since we've caught it and cleaned it in an orderly manner, we can send it south to the Everglades and not have to dump it in an emergency east and west. I mean, in a nutshell, that's what Everglades restoration is trying to do. And so east and west, here's the lake, and here's the lake, and here's the west coast. And we're going to build a big reservoir here to help catch local runoff so it doesn't glug into their estuary. Here's the St. Lucie, and they're building that reservoir right now. And here's the St. Lucie. They're going to do the same thing. They're going to try to build a reservoir that'll catch water and clean it before it goes into the St. Lucie or back to the lake. And these projects are just unimaginably large. And they take $1 billion and they take a decade to build. But if we don't build this, we're not going to get back to a healthier Lake Okeechobee or healthier estuaries or healthier Everglades. So this is the east and west plan. Meanwhile, north of the lake, we want to build some features up here to catch water. So when it rains, as I said, it doesn't all glug into the lake real fast. And then south of the lake, we want to be able to let the water out of the lake. And this is like, this structure here is about 25 square miles. And if you get on it, it's just unimaginably large. But these reservoirs are going to help. When Okeechobee gets too deep, we can pop water off to them. Then we'll hold it, we'll clean it, and we'll send it to the Everglades and make the Everglades work again. And, you know, our 50% of the Everglades, instead of having 10% of the bird life, hopefully we can get it back up to 50. And again, you know, the old problems of overhunting have been replaced by the new problems of habitat change. And here's the Kissimmee River Channel, which severely drained the valley. Here it is again. See the channel right there? The Corps has filled this in. And this water, if you notice, it's spread out. It's not going along, you know, on a super highway of a canal. It's getting cleaned by the marshes. And this is an ecological restoration project, but it's meeting our water management goals by slowing down the water and cleaning it. And if you build it, they will come. This project is supposed to be operational this year, so we're really excited about it. And I live 4 miles from it, so I'm really excited about it because I get to see it. And for human growth patterns, you know, we used to do this, and there's not room for a drop of water or a bird, and it's full of nutrients and stuff. And so this type of very intense development is giving way to this type of stuff where we're still going to grow a lot of food for humans. We need to do that. But rather than fight the natural features, we can leave them. And this water here is sitting here. It's not going anywhere. The citrus guys, this is a Likes Brother grove. And they told me, they said, well, we used to drain these big bays and then citrus trees wouldn't grow because it's still a low spot and they still get too much water. And so why fight it? Just leave it there and run some cows on it. So we're trying to build better, build smarter. This is a ranch and there's cows back there. And this is an embedded wetland. And notice these egrets are having a ball. If we're going to spend money to build big reservoirs, we're also trying to work with landowners and say, hey, can we pay you to plug your ditches? And when the rain comes, it's just going to stay on your property and not rush downstream. And so they can become part of the solution rather than being always seen as part of the problem. And here's an area where they did that. Here's some drained ranch lands. And this is over in the St. Lucie area. And here, this water, it's not rushing to the coast. It's not going anywhere. It's just sitting there and it's going to percolate. It's going to recharge aquifers. And so some of these natural solutions are really the proverbial win-win for everybody because we can catch water. We can give landowners another source of income, encourage them to keep their land wetter and create habitat for birds. So a lot of this isn't necessarily rocket science. We didn't value our wetlands enough, and to the extent we can, we want to rehydrate these watersheds. So I hope in the future we're going to have watersheds that have a hydrology that support these guys. These are on Bumblebee Island on Lake Istapoga, which is right next to my office. And when I climbed up and looked at them, I was in a ladder. And I said, this looks just like the museum. And then I realized, no, the museum looks just like this. And so I'll stop nattering. This is the end of the presentation. I hope you guys got something out of it. And I think we can do questions or listen to chats or whatever people want to do. So thank you very much for listening, folks.
Thank you so much, Paul. This was awesome. So hi, everybody. My name is Erica. I'm the communications director for Audubon, Florida, and I will be relaying your questions to Paul. So if you're on Zoom, feel free to put them in the chat. If you're on Facebook, just write a comment and I will get to them that way. So Paul, I want to go way back to the beginning of the presentation. What was the mistake that both of the bird artists made when one copied the other?
Yeah, that's a good question. Wilson, he identified a little warbler and a little flycatcher that we think probably was an immature of something. And he drew a picture of it, and everybody who's looked at the picture can't tell what it is. I forget what he called it, like the blue-headed warbler or something like that. And then the flycatcher also, he drew that, and no modern ornithologist can figure out what it was or identify it for sure. And so what we think he did was he got some kind of juvenile in a mixed plumage and thought it was its own subspecies, so or individual species. And you can read about it because people write about it a lot. You know, they like to compare the early guys. But again, you know, when you don't have a bird book and you see this bird you've never seen before, the question is it something in a different plumage, or is it something that I know about? I just haven't seen this phase of it. And that's really a hard question to answer. So, you know, we got to sympathize with these guys not getting everything right the first time.
And how did they preserve the bird skins that they collected so that we can still use them for data today?
Art. They really didn't have good preservation techniques, especially back in Wilson's day. I mean, you could salt birds, you know, try to dry them out like jerky, but that was kind of unsatisfactory. Sometimes they preserved them in alcohol, but you know, in a lot of Buffon's birds, he got them in alcohol, but the sailors would drink the rum before it got there, so they'd be kind of dried out and soaked in alcohol, and of course that's hard on colors. So art, if you can draw the bird and color it, you preserve that specimen forever. And that's part of the reason why, especially the very old bird artists were so active in drawing birds, is because we didn't have good techniques. And then the later 1800s, they started using arsenic, and then they started getting sick from it because it's so toxic. So that's part of the reason why we have so much bird art today is the problems of preservation.
Could you talk a little bit more about how the changing agricultural practices that you just mentioned pay landowners for keeping wetlands? Could you just talk a little bit more about that program?
Yeah, so the agencies have been trying to figure out if we want to keep Okeechobee from getting too deep every time we get a big storm, how much water do we need to store north of the lake? How much do we need to catch in any given storm? And the answer is equivalent to about 1 or 2 feet of Okeechobee water. And quite frankly, we're having trouble finding a way to do that. You could build a great big reservoir up north of the lake, but the water runs by it so fast that you can't fill the reservoir with, you know, no matter how big a pump you put on it. And also that reservoir would cover up actually a lot of really nice landscapes that are semi-natural and caracara habitat and stuff like that. And so what we want to do is a combination of things. We want to restore as many wetlands as we can. And since most of the watershed's privately owned, if you want to restore a wetland on someone's property, you got to pay them to do it. And yeah, you know, maybe we shouldn't have let them drain it in the first place, but that's where we are right now. And the landowners are pretty supportive of that approach, because if we, you know, sometimes we do easements, we buy the development rights from them, and then they agree to restore the wetlands. And that way they can get their economic investment out of it. And that way it stays green forever. And well, green and blue, it stays green and it stays wet. There's a whole bunch of different combinations of it. We're not going to be able to restore all the wetlands, so we're still going to have to build some kind of big boxy reservoir type things here and there. But that's something we're working on now, and it's complicated, and we got a big job. I could give you a clearer answer if I understood it better, but that's the problem. Is it's hard to imagine what all we're going to need to do to get to where we want to get.
No, that's very helpful. So when you take someone out to Lake Okeechobee who's never been there before, what is your favorite thing to show them?
Lake Okeechobee. No, I'm not joking. 1/3 of the lake can be vegetated. And so even though, you know, all the publicity and all the, the sensational news is about algae blooms, those things only occur, part of the time and not most of the time. But the marsh, even when the algae is raging in the middle of the lake, the marsh can be perfectly clean and beautiful. And that's one of the things I was doing in 2018. I'd take reporters clear back to the clean areas that are 2 miles from the open water and drink the water, and they'd be like, oh. But when we get back off the boat rides, the most common comment I get is, I had no idea, because there's just thousands of birds out there and plants, and there's fish and alligators and turtles, and it's just, and every time you go, it's different because it's a different time of year and the water levels are different. But every time you go, there's just great stuff to see.
I have to say, personally, I can't wait to go out there with you. So I hope we can do that in the near future.
Call me up.
So this is a question about Frank Chapman, and I think it's a good one. So Frank Chapman obviously did a lot for ornithology. He did a lot for conservation, but he also killed a lot of birds at a very impactful time for some of these populations. So how do you sort of approach that in your mind when you think about Frank Chapman?
I think about feathered documents as a pretty good excuse. The only Carolina parakeet skeleton that we have in existence is one that he made. But like I said, he also killed a lot. If you look at Arthur Cleveland Bent, who wrote one of the best Birds of North America account, he really had a comprehensive one. He did it 50 years ago or 70. When he died, he had a collection of 10,000 eggs, which went into a museum. And so those are important. And, those guys actually built us some collections that we don't have the pressure to collect new stuff now. But yeah, it's kind of a conflicting thing where, the same people who are trying to save the birds also are shooting them. And again, we're not shooting near the number that market hunters do or plume hunters, but it is kind of a seeming conflict.
So I know that we could ask and answer questions all night because this is a fascinating topic, and I'm sorry if I couldn't get to all of them, but I have 2 left in the time that we have left. Do you have boa constrictors, and I think they mean pythons, a problem in Lake O yet?
Not yet, but we expect them soon, and we're very nervous about that. They can get into wading bird colonies, and like that big water moccasin that ate snakes. If pythons take up those habits, we're going to have some real issues. And that's one of those things that I also don't know what to do about yet.
Yes, I think that's a common problem that we all share in the conservation community. So I said I only had one more, but then I'm going to cheat because I want to talk about grasshopper sparrows really quick. Can you just give us a quick snapshot of where we are with the Florida grasshopper sparrow releases this season? Where'd they go?
Yeah, so the Florida grasshopper sparrow population crashed in the last 20 years. And a couple of years ago, we were down to what we thought was less than 100 total. And we were really scared. But luckily, the Grasshopper Sparrow Working Group started a captive breeding program. It has had some bumps and starts, but we have now got them breeding pretty successfully. And as of this spring, we have let 299 Florida grasshopper sparrows go. And if you think about only 100 in the wild, that's an awful lot of birds. The thing we were worried about is if you let them go and they were raised in captivity, will they know they're supposed to be at the prairie? Will they go live in trees? Will they stay on the prairie? Or will they move to Georgia? Or will they know how to feed? Will they know how to hide from predators? Will they know, it's just the whole list of things we were worried about. And as it turns out that they survived pretty well. And the very first year that they were out on the prairie, last year they were breeding with wild birds in all combinations, and some of the grasshoppers, captive reared grasshoppers bred with each other in the wild and had successful nests. And so the breeding program's going well. We expect to let go a whole bunch more this year. And we don't really know why they declined. It might be a disease agent. And if so, they're not all dead and maybe they're getting herd immunity. We're not sure, but we're actually really happy that we know we can raise them and we know we can put them back out there. And we know that when we do it, they're successful. So I feel better about grasshopper sparrows than I have for 20 years.
That's great. So my last question is, what can people do? What can people do around Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades who want to, like you said, bring back the wading birds to 50%?
Support Audubon. We put out, yeah, we put out a series of action alerts and Save the Everglades publications, and Erica is in charge of all that. And if you join Audubon, you can get these fact sheets and information sheets, and you can donate money, or you can write to people or call people, decision makers, or just we need support both in our local governments and state and federal governments, and also just decision makers like the governing board. And when people, when I show up, they know I'm going to say I'm for the birds. But when just an average citizen shows up and says, I'm a carpenter and I want to have birds and I want to be able to go out in the woods and see them, that means a lot to decision makers. That it's not just those crazy environmentalists, it's just normal citizens who are taxpayers and they care about Florida. And that's your help really means a lot more than sometimes it feels like.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful presentation, and we have recorded it. It is available on Facebook, and it will be available at fl.audubon.org if you prefer to watch it as a YouTube link. So thank you so much, Dr. Gray. Thank you so much, everyone, for spending your evening with us, and we hope to see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.